One of the signs would be that intoxicants would be widely used. So you can see this happening in the Muslim world and just intensifying from quite some time ago. Another sign would be nakedness, that people would begin to remove their clothes. And he said until it would get to the point where people would actually walk around in the marketplaces in shorts with their thighs fully exposed. Right? It's in a hadith, al-mashyu fil aswaq wal afkhadu badiyatun, walking in marketplaces with the thighs fully exposed. He said also that people would have sexual intercourse in front of other people was a sign of the end of time. He said that it would get so bad that you would see people fornicating in public places, and the best people would be people who would say, "Can't you do that somewhere else?" Another one would be speed in travel. He said great distances would be traversed in very short times. And he said also that people would hop between the clouds and the earth. Al-qafsu bayn al-ardi wa sama. And he said that there would be musical instruments would be everywhere. And he said that also that people would dance with instruments on their head, which some have interpreted as headphones. That they would dance with instruments on their head, and they would spend the whole night dancing like that. And he also said that you would see singing women prevalent in public spaces. Because traditionally that was something that people did in private things, but he said it would become out open into the public. And he said that there would be many people he said takthur al-hawsat, which would be whisperings, like there would be many confused people that would have a lot of psychological type of problems. So, I mean, I could go on and on, it gets quite depressing. Those are signs. Now then there's the big ones. One of them is that in which the Prophet, the biggest of all, over is called the Antichrist towards the end of time. It's in Surah Al-Dukhan. The word in Arabic is from dajala. It means to smear a camel with tar. In other words, covering the whole body with tar. Smearing the part that is mangy or scabies. So it has the idea of hiding illness or sickness, covering it over, right? Covering it over with a black pitch. To lie, to conceal truth with falsehood, concealing the truth. He enchanted or fascinated. So the idea that the Antichrist is an enchanter or a fascinator. People are fascinated by him. He compressed. He traversed the regions or tracts of the earth or land. Now, the Prophet said that the Dajjal would enter every city on the planet. When they asked him what would his speed be like, he said like a wind that leaves a cloud in its trail. كَرِيحٍ اسْتَدْبَرَتْهُ السَّحَابِ. Literally means like a wind that leaves a cloud in its trail. And in another tradition, he said he would ride a white donkey made of iron, whose span between his two ears was 40 cubits. Baghlatun min hadid, is the hadith says. And then he says, to confuse, to mix things, having one eye. And most of them deal with the dangers of the world, of materialism. So I find it really interesting that, this idea of an imposter, that Jesus is, the whole thrust of the Islamic Jesus is salvation through giving up material wants. And the idea of an Antichrist is salvation through desire of material goods, that it is material goods that will make you happy, that is material goods that will save you. So I think there's a very materialistic element in here. And also the idea of being one-eyed is that part of binocular vision is depth perception, which you lose with one eye. And so the idea that that the Dajjal or the Antichrist does not have a depth perception. He's a two-dimensional being. He sees things in two dimensions. And some of the Muslim scholars do not consider it an individual, but most do. And some, and you'll see it as we go on here. Having one eye is one of them. Also to gild a thing. So in other words, you take lead, you put gold over it. That's yudajjal. So to make something that's cheap or insignificant look very worthwhile or significant. Cover the land with water. He put his land into a right or proper state, prepared it, improved it with dung. So to spread dung on the earth, to spread feces on the earth. Dajjal, dung for manuring land. And then Dujjal is refuse, lowest, basest, or meanest sort of people. The lowest, basest, or meanest sort of people. Dajjal, a gilder, a liar, conceals truth with falsehood, who deceives, deludes, beguiles, circumvents, outwits, much or often, very deceitful, the great deceiver. And then a great company of men, Dajjala in Arabic means a great company of men journeying together, covering the ground by their multitude, or a company of men journeying together, carrying goods for sale. Right? So trafficking goods all over the place. Masih al-Kadhab, the false Christ or Antichrist, is to be a certain man, right? Comes forth in the last days. So having one eye or eyebrow. So you get the idea there. This is, Prophet Muhammad said, every prophet has warned his people about the Dajjal, but I will tell you something that no other prophet told his people. He only has one eye. So that was the tradition that he said about the Dajjal, that he would have one eye. And there's a very interesting, some of the Muslims said, you know, the television is like a Dajjal, it's a one-eyed type beast. There's an interesting section in Lewis Mumford's, the second volume of his work on the Mega Machine, which is the eye of the one eye of Re, the all-seeing eye of Re. And he talks about that the Mega Machine, one of the things about the Mega Machine, he said traditionally, was that they didn't have an all-seeing power, these previous kings and rulers. And so he said what's happening though is that, and he wrote this in 1961, he said, in the near future, we have theoretically at our hands a machine that will able to monitor all of our life, which is the computer. And he said that, and this is what Foucault called the panoptic society, the all-seeing society. And it was designed after the idea of a prison system that Jeremy Bentham designed, which was where you had a centerpiece, utilitarianism. You had this center, you only needed one guard. And around the guard were all the prison cells. So in the middle was a tower, which this one guard could watch everything at one time. And so the idea of the all-seeing, you know, the state apparatus in which we're all monitored. A really interesting book about this subject is called I can see the cover because it's got that pyramid with the eye on it. And then the next after the birth of Mistress is that you will see the barefooted, naked, destitute herdsmen competing in constructing lofty buildings. Now at one level this is seen by many people in the modern time, the idea of, you know, the Bedouin people now in the Arabian Peninsula building all these, you know, they were literally destitute people 40, 50 years ago. And when I was in the United Arab Emirates, I was once in the Majlis of Sheikh Sultan Al-Qasimi, who's the ruler of Sharjah. And, you know, they're very kind of pompous majlis, you know, there's a lot of protocol and things. But there was this guy that came in literally in almost rags. And he came in dirty and he barefoot, comes walking in quite arrogantly, goes up to the ruler, shakes his hand, then sits down. And I asked the person next to me, who's that? And he said it's his cousin, you know, but he's still like a Bedouin out in the, he lives out in the, and it was just, you know, it was a Bedouin guy, lives in a tent, but, you know, his cousin had become the ruler of the country. So I thought that was really interesting, this idea of these, you know, poor people. And then building, a very interesting phenomenon in Arabia is building buildings and then another sheikh getting upset because so-and-so built a taller building than him. He'll actually tear down his building and build up one taller than the second one. Right? And this is also in our own culture, the New York the Empire State Building was the tallest, and then the Chicago building one up them, and then the World Trade Center, and then you have now in Malaysia, interestingly enough, very proud. The Malaysians are very proud that they now have the tallest building in the world. And somebody had it on the cover of a Muslim magazine, and they asked me what I thought, and I said, I think it's really interesting that the Muslims are proud of being part of fulfilling the signs of the end of time, right? Because it's seen as a very negative thing, not a positive thing. And then also, there's another way to look at this, of building tall buildings, like these kind of wretched people, and that is the idea of building lofty ideas and building ideological structures, because the Quran talks about the building of taqwa, bunyanu taqwa, right? The building of God consciousness and awareness. So the idea also of wretched people creating lofty ideologies that many people will follow and think that they're the truth and things like that. So it's just a very quick overview about it. And then also finally, I think the point of all of that is that time does come to an end, that the human condition does come to an end, and that's how Islam contextualizes history, is that there is an end that is imminent. Again, I think for the individual person, the imminence of the end of time is always related to their own personal death. But there is an idea also. And then there's another important, I think a very important idea within the Islamic tradition, and that is that each generation will be they will be fulfilling the idea of this dimensional Islam, of Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. They will not do it as well as the previous generation. That there is an idea that each generation is a watered down version. There are periods of renewal historically, and the Prophet Muhammad did say that there would be renewers every 100 years or so. There would be people that come and renew. But the idea that it's not the same. I mean, I think the Muslims do have an idea, traditional Muslims anyway, that it's not so much progress, but quite the opposite. One of the things René Guénon pointed out about the rapid speed of progress, he said one of the things that we forget is increasing acceleration means going down, not up, right? That the idea of the modern world, and I think there's a lot of questioning now of the wisdom of the idea. Bacon introduced the idea of progress, because prior to that the Christians did not have that idea within their worldview of that we are progressing. They had quite a different idea. And I think ultimately from the Muslim worldview and also from other traditional worldviews, that the same ethical issues that Plato is positing through Socrates, what is justice? How do we lead a good life? What is a good life? These things we have not come any closer, right, to really, progressing in terms of our ethical nature, in terms of our spiritual nature. That although we have massive outward technology, able to do extraordinary things, bring the living back, bring the dead back to life, move mountains, quite literally. Despite that, we are still dealing with basic human tendencies such as greed, lust, envy, slothfulness. It's hard to get away from those. And in some ways, we're less aware of our own negative tendencies than perhaps. But the Prophet Muhammad said, if the end of time comes upon you and you're planting a tree, then finish planting it. In other words, don't become millenarians. Don't become people that run off and just the end is here. No, do what you're doing. Keep working. Keep doing it. If it happens, and you happen to be there when it happens. But don't let that stop you from action. So there is an idea of, yes, there is an end of time. There are signs. Now, in the tradition here, the first thing he asks him about the end of time, he says, tell me about the sa'ah, the hour. And he says the one being questioned doesn't know any more than the one questioning. In other words, I don't know. And he says, well, then tell me about its signs. And then the Prophet says, peace be upon him, the slave girl will give birth to her mistress. Now, that's an interesting statement. The slave girl will give birth to her mistress. And the scholars traditionally dealt with that in a lot of different ways. One of them is they said at the end of time, slaves who in the Islamic, like for instance, the Mamalik became rulers. And many of the scholars said this is it. The Mamalik were slaves in Egypt, and they actually became rulers. They said, here they are. They've become the masters. Another interpretation was that children would treat their parents like, this is a traditional interpretation, that children would treat their parents like servants. They would order them around. They would tell them what to do, that there would be a loss of respect in that relationship. But I think probably the deepest interpretation is that there would be a radical disequilibrium in social structures. When you look at the relationship between a servant and a mistress, the relationship is like a mother and a daughter. The mother is to be obeyed, nurturing the daughter obeys the mother. When that is turned upside down, then you have a radical disruption in the social order. If you look in the Quranic narrative, the first and foremost expression of a tawhidic worldview, of a belief in one God, is ihsan to the parents, beauty to the parents, showing beauty to the parents. The Quran says, and God has told the human being to honor his parents. The mother first, it says, Ummuhu hamalathu wahnan ala wahn. The mother nurtured and gave birth to the child, sapped and weakened. Right? So the 9 months of nurturing a child in the womb, giving birth, suckling the child, raising the child, changing the child, doing all of these things, that there is a great debt owed, the child to the parent, particularly the mother. And this is why the Prophet said that the paradise is at the feet of the mothers. It's literally at the feet of the mothers. And the Prophet was once asked, who is the most worthy of my companionship? And the Prophet answered, your mother. And then he said, and then who? He said, your mother. And he said, and then who? He said, your mother. And he said, and then who? He said, your father. And then in another tradition, a man came to him and he said, Ya Rasulullah, O Messenger of God, I am cleaning my mother in her decrepit age the way she used to clean me. Is that filial piety? And he said, no, that's payback.